We're here. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today, wherever you are. It's noontime here on the East Coast where I am, but my name is Peter Williamson. I'm going to be moderating, playing a couple roles today, moderating and having a great conversation with three good friends. And we're here to talk about how you can be a philanthropist and defining the giving journey at any age. I want to just kind of set the stage for today. This is a webinar format. We have the option for you to type questions that we will attempt to answer at the end of the session here. If it's super pertinent to the conversation we're having real time, we're going to try to answer it then as well. And so again, I've been kind of joking with the panelists today. I'm sitting near a fireplace to remind myself that this is a fireside chat. I also have a crazy kitten that may disrupt the screen in some way. So we really want this to be open and have some fun and talk about how you can be a philanthropist kind of at any age, at any time, at any place of your career or life. And so kind of with that set stage, also want to kind of position us here in the Philanthropy Together We Give Summit event. This is the last day of the first week. This is sort of the free version of the Philanthropy Together event, and we'd love to remind people to upgrade to the All Access Pass to get access to the future events over the next coming weeks. There are codes that I'm sure the team can share about some discounts and ways to get into the sessions in the following weeks. So please reach out. I think the goal is to get as many people into these sessions as possible. So with that being said, I want to introduce the amazing panel here today. And if you want to type in the chat where you're coming from, feel free to do that as well. I will start with myself. I will kind of give a name, brief introduction, kind of role and work that we do. And then we'll jump into some kind of open conversation about philanthropy. So my name is Peter Williamson. As I mentioned, I am from New Hampshire originally. I currently live just north of the Washington, D.C. area in Maryland, and I am a game designer. It's a long, very nonlinear trajectory to how I got to be a game designer, but I'm very passionate about using games and play to call out certain inequities and think about how to have meaningful conversations in our community. So I'm then going to pass it over to Nick Tedesco for a quick introduction of himself.
Great, thanks Peter. Hi everyone, it's wonderful to be in conversation with you all today. So my name is Nick Tedesco and I have the distinct privilege of leading the National Center for Family Philanthropy. We are a community of philanthropic families who are committed to learning and growing together, and I'm really excited for the conversation.
Perfect, thank you, Nick. Amy, you want to go next?
Hello, my name is Amy Neugebauer, and I'm the executive director of the Giving Square. And the Giving Square is all about engaging and promoting philanthropy with kids. And our flagship program is the Kids for Kids Fund, which works with 8 to 12-year-olds specifically. And we work in schools and religious organizations and community organizations. And while we build a foundation for giving, we culminate in kids really experiencing a giving circle themselves. So we currently are running 26 giving circles, all done by kids, 8 to 12-year-olds, and they're about to give around $29,000 worth of grants to local kids serving organizations. So I'm really excited about this summit because it really aligns with what I spend my life doing.
Awesome, thank you, Amy. And Alyssa?
Hello to everyone from Maine on beautiful Abenaki lands up here in Maine today. My name is Alyssa Wright. I'm the principal consultant at Wright Consulting Group, where we offer philanthropic advising to millennials and capacity building services to the causes that they support and the movements that they support. I'm so excited to be here today after having spent a career advising a lot of millennials when I discovered being in many philanthropic rooms and at many fundraising events that I was the youngest person by 25, 30 years, often in certain conversations, and so have shaped a practice that I feel like is really important to our space. And I'm excited to share my stories today of working with this really incredible generation that I get to be a part of and eat avocado toast with a couple days a week. So really excited to share more with you all, and thank you, Peter, for having us introduce ourselves today.
Absolutely. Thank you to the three of you for being here with me. I find all three of you have helped my trajectory in some way in thinking about philanthropy. And that's, I think, what's really exciting is when thinking about yourself as a philanthropist, kind of digging into your own story and really thinking about the why and the how you want to make an impact on your community is accessible to everybody. And I hopefully kind of through this conversation, we can kind of start to unearth some of the magic behind storytelling and why each person brings a unique flavor to the field. To kind of start with myself as just a way to introduce kind of our first topic of conversation, I am from a sixth-generation family foundation. And while family foundations are not the most accessible to join, I've found that the experience of being a part of a philanthropic entity since I was a little kid has been really influential on my journey and how I've gotten to be a game designer that's thinking about how to use play to bring more people into philanthropy. I've learned so much through giving back to the community, and I think seeing family members and friends be constantly engaged in that space has really helped. And so kind of with that, bringing in Nick, who runs the National Center for Family Philanthropy, I think it was one of my first connections as I moved into the DC area and really trying to think about how to be a member of a family, but also do my part in elevating my privilege to bring other people into this space. So Nick, would love for you to share a little bit about your story, and then I'll follow up with a couple things that we can riff on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been such a joy, Peter, to get to know you and your family, and really excited for the conversation. So I'll share a little bit about my trajectory and then also share some observations from an organizational perspective, and then would love to get into that conversation a little bit deeper as time allows. So for me personally, I was raised in the Northeast with a very large extended family. My grandfather emigrated from Greece at an early age and brought over a number of his family members. And so I was really raised on the values of community, community and service. The idea of community being your family, the extension of your family, and those who you're living your everyday lives with. So my mother, who remains my single biggest influence, made sure that I understood what it meant to be part of a community, right? That we are all connected to one another, that we are in service of one another. And that's something that I really brought through my experience personally and professionally. And so when I look back at my trajectory, the themes that were carried through are those themes of community and service. So I went off to college and was drawn to a university that had a strong bend towards both community and service, and spent time volunteering and exploring what those themes meant to me, and then decided to professionally enter the social sector to give back in the way that I knew how, which was with my time and my passion. So my trajectory led me to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where I helped build and launch the Giving Pledge campaign. And I spent a number of years working with philanthropic individuals and families throughout the United States and the world on what it means to be giving back to each of those individual philanthropists and philanthropic families. And so, as I look back at my time in this sector thus far, I look at the shape that philanthropy has taken for me. And that really is, as I mentioned, my passion. It's my time, it's my experience, and it's my commitment. I would also say it's my conviction to connect people with similar interests and to hold space. I really get excited about the idea of being a convener and to facilitating conversations. Because I do think that a lot of our evolution as individuals and as community comes in reflection and commitment that we can carry through the change that we're all capable of carrying through. So that's a little bit of my personal story, but wanted to share what we're seeing from the National Center for Family Philanthropy perspective. So as I mentioned, we're a community of philanthropic families, and we have been reflecting on all of the changes that we all have been experiencing over the last 12 plus months, whether it's the pandemic, the racial justice movement, the historic elections, and many other global events. And something that I would acknowledge here is that we are in a significant moment of shift for the social sector. And it's really transforming in three ways. It's transforming through pace, practice, and purpose. And I like to share this often with our community. The first is that the pace of giving is accelerating, right? We're acknowledging and seeing that many individuals and families are shifting into action as a result of events over the last 12 months. And we're seeing people that are feeling compelled, motivated, inspired to give, and many to give big and to give now. And in many ways, this current moment is a reminder of that long-held belief that philanthropic capital is risk capital. It's capital that can promote innovation. And so in many ways, all of us are being asked to revisit what our commitments are. I would say the second way that it's shifting is through the practice. We're starting to see a normalization of trust-based approaches. We're starting to see people address how best to minimize or eliminate power dynamics and the burdens that are placed on grantee organizations. How can we look at leveraging tools like multi-year grants and fewer reporting requirements and shifting to general operating support? How can all of us listen and be proximate to community? And how can we understand that our best way to show up is through servant leadership? And how can we be more closely connected to the work? And I'd say the last way that we're seeing the sector shift is through the purpose. The purpose of philanthropy itself, in whatever form or fashion it's taking, is being revisited. So the very concept of stewardship in many ways is being challenged, right? This idea of, what is the role of the individual in advancing change? And how do we reconcile longstanding systemic oppression and racism? And how do we start to think about what our roles and our opportunities are as individuals to affect change? So I think what we're seeing is many individuals and families think about, what is that purpose for us? Why are we doing this work? And how can we reflect on what it means to be truly a steward of the public trust? So I'll pause there. A lot more things that we're observing. Yeah. Happy to go into a lot more later. Yeah.
Yeah, it resonates obviously a lot because there's so many threads to pull kind of from my experience in our own family foundation and thinking about that pace, practice, and purpose. Everything from kind of our next generation of folks in our family trying to push some of these measures forward because they're passionate about a whole new different set of issues or issues that have been around for a long time and they're just kind of surfacing up as something that people want to focus on as their philanthropic impact. You mentioned a lot of the trust-based philanthropy pieces. That's, I think, coming up a lot in different philanthropic spaces. And so pulling that through, whether it be a giving circle or different types of entities, I think is something that I've really tried to focus on and help our family with. And then that reconciliation has always been sort of the driving force for me. My great-great-grandfather was an inventor of a lot of products. Those products still have use today, but have created some bit of impact on the environment. And so for me, as someone who really cares about our green natural spaces, what can I do to help elevate some of these messages? And I know there was no way to predict that 5 generations ago that it was going to have such an impact, but thinking about how we can be more dynamic and address some of the new needs that are current. So Nick, just want to kind of pass it back to you. What have you seen in kind of this pass down from generation to generation in families in terms of the conversations that are having? And then maybe we can use some of those points kind of with Amy and Alyssa as well.
Yeah, again, I think that this is a moment of reflection for families. And I think there's a couple of notes that I would add here. So one is, I think that we're seeing the next generation engage in a really substantial and meaningful way, and a historic way in a lot of instances, in that, the virtual environment that has emerged over the last year has really promoted engagement that has gone beyond some of the traditional barriers, right? Oftentimes for families in a traditional foundation structure, having to attend a meeting in a city, that's taking 3 days out of your life has been a barrier. and being in a boardroom, right, that felt inaccessible to many of the next generation, equally felt like it was a barrier. And so what we're seeing now is the virtual environment really normalizing participation and encouraging participation of the next generation. We're also seeing, in a lot of ways, the elder generation looking to the next generation to think about new tools, solutions, and approaches, and inviting in their ideas. And that's really exciting, right? To see this generational shift happening, and to also see the next generation, which unto itself is quite a loaded term that we could dissect, but the emerging generation as, the generation that feels like this is their moment, right? We all feel like this is our moment to look at things differently. And it goes back to this question of stewardship. What I'm seeing in terms of the application of that are new tools and new approaches, right? So impact investing and advocacy are two really great examples of that, right? How do we align all of our capital for good? How do we think about not just traditional grant dollars going out to make meaningful difference in community, but how do we think about where we're banking and what that means and what harm that may or may not be doing? How do we think about investing in community? And so there's a lot of approaches that I think are emerging that are being ushered in by that younger generation of philanthropists. And I think that there is also just more global connectivity, and we're all aware of what's happening around the world, right? I mean, I don't know that we all would have been nearly as aware of what's going on, the tragedy in India right now, if it wasn't for social media and the internet and all the advents that have come in the last couple of decades. And thank God that we all are aware, because we can activate, because knowledge is power, right? And I think that what we see is the champions of change being those next generation, the agents of change. So what I would say is we always encourage families to think about how to bring in those voices early and often, and to really empower and normalize the power dynamics that might prevent the next gen to engage. And we're really excited to see what is on the horizon.
Yeah, no, that's great. And a perfect transition, I feel like, and thinking about how families are talking about that sort of emerging generation. I agree with you. Next gen feels like a loaded term, and I don't even know if I fit in it anymore, which is somewhat depressing in its own right. But I have found engaging our earliest generation, our sixth generation, are all kids. Getting them into philanthropy in some way has been a really meaningful part of kind of my journey within the Family Foundation, but it's also something that I've really enjoyed connecting with Amy about. Amy's work is all around families and youth and getting kids engaged. So Amy, I would love for you to share kind of your story and how you got to where you are to kick things off there.
Awesome. Yeah, I kind of feel like we're the next generation. Or I spend my time, I'm certainly not the next generation. So I want to share that when I was a kid, I think I was always philanthropic. Like, I think I had this intention. And I remember being a kid and being really distressed by the fact that Japanese internment camps had existed in my state. I grew up in Washington State. So as a kid, that made no sense. And it was very disconcerting. I also remember that our school mascot was the Warriors, and that felt so wrong. And when I had conversations with people about it, there was a normalization of this, that it wasn't wrong, because it was something the school promoted, and it wasn't, the discourse then was not the same that it is now. I also really didn't understand why anyone needed to be homeless. So I remember very early that I had these bigger injustices that I cared about. I was also excessively shy. I wanted to be invisible. I wanted Santa Claus to give me an invisibility cloak. I didn't raise my hand much in class. I probably dressed in very neutral colors. I went through a phase where I actually wrote as small as humanly possible, which I now see probably another attempt at invisibility. But I was so drawn to philanthropy that I needed to overcome that. So I share those two things as context as I share a couple anecdotes. So in junior high, we had a visiting, somebody staying with our family, and he was a storyteller, very eccentric, wonderful man. And he was like spreading the word of peace and how do we work across differences and engage in peace building. So he was speaking at my school and in my social studies classroom. So as he was speaking in the class, I was so proud. The messages he was sharing were so vivid and aligned with what I cared about. So I walk him outside, come back into the room, and the kids are making fun of him, which is horrifying because that just is embarrassing, deflating, all of those things. The worst thing is that the teacher was in on it and he was participating in the mocking of this experience. And I remember being upset about the kids, but I visually remember every moment about this because it hurt. And I had this aha that, wow, teachers must really need to be cool too. Fast forward to high school. I'm not going to go through every stage of my life, by the way, just these two. High school, I started a club because I saw that English as a second language students were isolated from the student body. So started a club. You needed a teacher sponsor. Found a teacher sponsor. Random fact about him: he is about the board behind his desk filled with his trophies. Just a side note, random fact about him. So I'm leading the first session. I'm terrified. Again, this is Miss Invisibility Cloak doing this. We have the agenda for the first meeting. People come in, many of them my friends, some that I don't know at all, start through the agenda. He physically stands up, walks in front of me and says to me, "It looks like you don't got this." I have no idea what happened after that. I know that the club lived on. I found a different sponsor, but to have an adult in the middle of you being brave and standing out saying, "You don't got this," is pretty painful. So I share this because here are two examples of a brave, shy kid drawn to be philanthropic. And in front of my peers, I had adults invalidate my work, who I was, and my instincts. And so no surprise, 25 years later, after a 25-year career in philanthropy and community development and social innovation, my job is all about seeing the potential of kids like me, because there are lots of kids that were like me. And so how do we take the structures, and it could be people, like the two teachers I had, it could be practices, and it could be expectations. So that's kind of the personal drive behind the work I do.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of kind of like using and leveraging story and kind of your personal experience. And thanks for sharing. Thanks for sharing those examples. I'm now really curious to kind of get a little bit more out of kind of the best practices that you've seen in engaging kids over kind of this project with the Giving Square. I've been amazed by the growth and just trajectory of Giving Square, kind of regionally and locally, and connecting with kids, but also families. So could you share a little bit about what you've seen be kind of the things that work the best, or maybe tools that have helped you get there?
So I would say, like, as a baseline, the first thing is that we have to see the potential in kids. And so shift our frame from kids are kind of people we train to be relevant in the future, to beings that are valid and really important now. And if you look at research, kids are really strong at fluid thinking. They're really empathetic. And if we don't nurture that, that goes away. And they really see injustice. I think any parent on this call knows that the why is like tapping into injustice. So working with kids is pretty phenomenal. There are three things that I would recommend, and that we've learned from working with about 1,000 kids in this work, is that the first is go deeper. And kids have reported to us that the number one reason that they are not more philanthropic and aren't doing more is because adults don't listen. So 54% say that the number one reason is that that adults don't listen, which as an adult and a parent is a bit of a knife. What I've also experienced is kids can really handle the complexity. So in our Kids for Kids Fund discussions, kids are sharing about COVID, about systemic racism, about, and it's not, and it's like nuanced what they're talking about. They're talking about their parents struggling with cancer, their own experience with cancer. So kids are seeing and observing and thinking about really deep things. So it's on us to facilitate a safe space for that to come out. And superficial doesn't work for kids. Although most kids have been involved with charity. Alison Boddy out of the University of Kent, she's done some research, and while most kids have been involved, when they are involved, only 20% of kids can actually tell you what they just did and what it was for. So go deeper is my first recommendation. The second I would say is go broader. Kids don't have money and don't earn it themselves. And so when they're giving money, it's not theirs to, they don't really feel like it's theirs to give, or they're giving of themselves in the same way. So the discussions around time, talent, treasure, testimony, those are really important. In a kid context, we talk about it as body parts. So we talk about the brain and what can you do to research? And I mean, even Peter, your example about game design and your grandfather. So how can you use your brain? How can you use your ears to be a good listener? How can you speak up, use your mouth? So et cetera, et cetera. So make it accessible and make it broader. And also informalize it too. We had kids in our program track what acts of philanthropy they were witnessing. And it was really interesting because it wasn't formal acts. It wasn't the canned food drives, the lemonade stands. It was, I taught my brother how to read. I helped my mom when she's sad. It's the informal. And we asked like, who was the recipient of it? 30% or 29% of the time it was friends. 27% of the time it was family. The next biggest was school community. So kind of informalize it is another way to do it. And then my third recommendation is really to focus on the why and not the how. So we spent a lot of our time in our program really perspective taking and talking about life isn't fair and what do all kids deserve. So because kid quotes are always inspiring, I'm just going to kind of close with a couple things or some things that kids say that all kids deserve. So kids deserve to have happy moments, to go to sleep and have a nice warm bed, healthy food, clean water, chicken nuggets, specifically from McDonald's, lots of candy, a safe home, and to be able to walk outside without being afraid, protection if a family member dies, heavy, to have people learn their stories, to have their voices heard, to understand the world around them, the chance to stand up for what's right, to be challenged and to have people have high expectations of us, and to help others.
Amazing. Yeah, I'm always amazed by kids' openness when you talk to them, especially now being, I don't know, in my 30s. I have found that that element of play slowly disappears from our lives, and working with kids, you can see that open, more transparent view of the world, which is very refreshing a lot of the time, and wish that we can kind of bring that into the workforces and kind of as you grow up, keep kind of that element of play. And so that's a perfect transition to Alyssa in thinking about how we can address kind of the millennial generation. But would love to get your story and then kind of pick apart some of those pieces.
Yeah, totally. Thank you so much, Peter. Amy, so much of what you shared resonates with me because I feel like my philanthropic journey started at like 18 months old and it just wasn't acknowledged or recognized in certain ways. So just thank you for sharing. So I'm always a little envious when, we're sharing personal stories of how people arrived in philanthropy because I didn't grow up in kind of the warm, fuzzy sort of, culture of giving. In some ways I did, but I grew up working class poor, don't know my biological father, have had a long, difficult, strange relationship with my mom. And so much of what I think I wanted from a really early age was to find family and community and belonging and to figure out what that was going to look like. And so, very similar to what you shared, Amy, I think there was something inside of me that innately was like, I'm just going to go out into the world and do the best I can to love and hope that it comes back. Because I spent a lot of my childhood feeling unloved and unwanted. So I thought if I go out and make people feel loved and wanted, maybe that reciprocity will show back up in my corner. And And I think that was really true as a young person. And I'll share one story with you that I think really defines kind of how I've gone forward as a self-identified millennial, working with other millennials to really think about how our generation can challenge and influence philanthropy to change and to evolve for the better in this moment. And a lot of it is small silent things that maybe will never be in case studies or reports or on people's websites or in testimonials. They're things that happen along the pathway that don't often get acknowledged, but that happen in a really silent sort of way. So I remember growing up, we had a lot of big family gatherings in the summertime. And one summer we had a gathering and a bunch of my uncles, great uncles and cousins were outside and they were talking about this local domestic violence shelter and some of the programs there. And I very distinctly, growing up, I had known that both my mother and some other women in my family were victims of gender-based violence. And so even from a young age, I had known that, right? So to your story, Amy, like I had this consciousness, at 8 or 9 years old, that was part of my mother's narrative, even though it wasn't overtly shared with me. And I would think about it a lot. And so I remember being at this family cookout and hearing everyone kind of talking. And I distinctly remember hearing one of my great uncles say something like, well, why don't they just leave? Why can't they just figure out those situations? And just this really kind of negative, lack of compassion sort of response to it. And so I thought about it for a while. I knew the organization he was talking about because my mom had volunteered with it through her job. And so I circled back with my mom a couple days later, opposite from you, Amy. I was kind of like the town mayor when I was 9. I'm very extroverted, ENFJ over here. So I was kind of always had the lemonade stand and everybody was coming to hang out with me on their skateboards. Like that was sort of my thing. And so I decided after hearing about this organization and kind of feeling a little bit like, oh, like I don't like this like energy and way that people are talking about women in my family and in some of my community. I said, okay, you know what I'm going to do? I know how to iron. I ironed these little things on a pegboard. I don't know if you ever had those as a kid. You put the little plastic pieces on a pegboard and then you put wax paper on it and you ironed it and hung it up in the window. It was like a sun catcher. So I made 30 of those in one afternoon because I knew Saturday was the hot lemonade stand day. And after I made all 30 of those sun catchers, I laid them out in front of my lemonade stand back in Western Massachusetts. And as every car drove by, I was flagging people down, everybody walking by, asking them to buy one for 50 cents, $1, and filling up the little jar at my lemonade stand. And so at the end of the day, I had sold all of them. Turns out that I could have had a great career in sales and marketing if I didn't go into the philanthropic world. But I had sold all of them by the end of the day and closed up shop and walked back in the house and proudly handed the money to my mom and said, I made $27.11 and I want to donate it to that domestic violence program. And so at that very young age, I remember feeling really powerful in being able to do that and a different type of power than I think we talk about a lot in society. And at a very young girl discovering that in a really simple way. But I didn't let it stop there because I think that's where also too in the philanthropy world, and I'm seeing this with my own generation now as an advisor, we sometimes stop, right? So we made the donation or we gathered the funds and then we give it to the organization. And so what I thought was really important was to go to that next hangout, which was a couple weekends later, everybody's out on the lawn and all the uncles and great uncles and cousins are running around. And to very loudly and audibly at a very young age, say in front of that same group, so I'm really excited about that money I donated by selling all my sun catchers last weekend. They're going to be able to help the women get jobs now because they can buy suits with some of the money I raised. And I just felt like that was so important. And I remember there was some eye rolling and some kind of like, she's just a kid. And throughout the rest of my life, I remember that different type of feeling of power. It was small and silent, but it was so significant standing in the grass barefoot at 9 years old and being able to have that moment. And so much of what I feel like is important for us when we think about the millennial generation, because there are a lot of stereotypes out there about us. You can't open up the newspaper or open up a magazine once or twice a day and not see something about how in debt we are, or the avocado toast shtick or something, which I now make light of. We love our craft breweries, all these different things. I don't think we can make light of how many small silent things millennials are doing that sometimes go unrecognized as we're trying to kind of move things forward. And so I think if there's anything that I would kind of point to as maybe just some trends or something to be thinking about is I'm watching a lot of millennials now do what I did in the grass at that family gathering within their workplace. And I'm super excited about it. Like, I'm like, yeah, go you in the workforce. They're bringing those values that they find in places like giving circles or within some family giving program that they have, whatever it might be, whatever their more traditional vehicle is. And they're going back to their workplace and they're really pushing on those things to change. And they're pushing on those things to change, not only with their dollars, but also in a dialogue driven way. And so I think the reason I find like the giving circle space and conversation and education so important is that is where I think a lot of the real change can happen. And it's exciting to see millennials kind of pushing for that next step within their companies. And then the second thing that I think is just really important to kind of name, and I think Nick and Amy, you kind of echoed this both in your comments, is there's this trust movement, but I do feel like a lot of millennials struggle to trust themselves when they first start to give. And I don't think we talk about trusting ourselves enough. And I really see that with my, I can't tell you after every family meeting I've facilitated or conversation that I've had at a brown bag lunch at a corporation in downtown Boston, how many millennials have emailed me afterwards and said like, oh shoot, should I have done that? I shouldn't have done that. We'll let it sit for 6 more months because I don't know if I should keep talking about it. And so I just want to call in this idea of trusting ourselves and learning how to build a relationship to ourselves in this process that allows us to feel as confident as possible in what we're trying to move forward. Because I do think that's part of the trust-based conversation we haven't really had as deep as we could. And it's a big part of our own sort of healing and liberation as a generation going forward.
Yeah, I love that. It ties this into a very neat little bow, which is I appreciate. But that whole concept of trusting yourself and being in spaces where you feel comfortable. Amy talked about kind of going deeper and broader and thinking about how you can bring people together the way that Nick was thinking about convening and using that as a space of reflection. I think all of you kind of hit on the point in a similar way, as you said, Alyssa. And it's just really exciting because you're seeing a lot of energy at the grassroots level, but that energy is moving its way up and forcing kind of this bottom up and top down change, which hopefully at some point they meet in the middle and they find a good kind of position. But I think there's so many different ways that you can be a catalyst. I think all 3 of you touched on that really well. And as a game designer and thinking about sort of what my role is in a lot of the work that I'm doing, it's connecting a lot of these points together. It's building those safe spaces to play and to think about reflection and to try and build some of these terminologies and literacies around topics you may not know as much about, but you're around people that you trust. It's your friends groups, it's your social networks. And so I want to kind of pass it back to you, Alyssa, because I know you've mentioned the giving circles. I've helped found a giving circle here in the DC area for the Next Gen community, but wanted to get your thoughts about the sort of the giving circle, what the giving circle means to you and how other people can get involved in that space.
Yeah, so I'll share a brief story about sort of the power I feel like of the collaborative giving movement overall and why giving circles are so special. I think one of the unique things about the millennial generation, especially older millennials, kind of those of us born between 81 and 88, I think that there's something about, really showing up and trying to use that kind of giving circle platform, one, again, as something to relate to the community, to make impact in your local community around particular issues or things that you care about. But I also think there's this unspoken dynamic of kind of finding your crew, finding that real sense of belonging and chosen family that share your values. Because I'll be honest, a lot of the generations that came before me, we have very different value sets. Not around every issue or topic, but there's some tension in my own family and in some of the families that I've been gifted to work in, where it's how do you navigate those conversations? And it's nice to have the giving circle as kind of a place of belonging to discuss those sort of pieces that come out of while you're learning how to do carbon offsetting in the Caribbean and choose a few international grantees, right? There's all these other things that come up in that process that I think are really important. And I also feel like, and just to throw a little kind of data point out there, only 23% of millennials really identify as donors or philanthropists, but 78% identify as volunteers. and as community organizers and activists, like that's more language that we tend to lean towards. So I think even though some of that volunteerism really comes with also giving philanthropically, I still think there's a lot more that can happen with bringing our financial resources to it. And I think that that's what's really exciting about this Giving Circle moment is that I think the next generation is looking for ways to have these dialogues within their companies, within their families. And so it kind of creates this way for you to say, let's just do this practice together versus, hey, let's talk about this really difficult topic. And that's something that I think the dominant culture doesn't always kind of create space for us to do, to settle into a journey or a process or something like that. And so I think that instead of just making quick decisions or saying, hey, we've got to move some money, we have to address this issue, it's really giving people some time to spend in process. And I think that's what I love about the Giving Circle. It's kind of, the whole model is revolutionary in nature because it's saying, hey, let's be intentional and kind of slow down and breathe into it.
And I would love to just jump in that one thing I've observed in giving circles, at least in kids, and I think it's a profound opportunity for giving circles, is that giving circles are formal philanthropy, but I also see that giving circles can be a way that there's a lot of informal philanthropy that happens between. And so as kids have shared all of these personal things, there are acts of micro philanthropy or lowercase philanthropy that happens within the group. So it's almost a community of philanthropy that informally, but that does formal philanthropy externally too.
Yeah, and even thinking about, Nick, in the family philanthropy space, I know at least our family has started talking about ways that we can carve out sort of a Giving Circle-esque model for our next generation in families, so that there's this kind of safer space around, their family members, but peers, right? It's your peer group of similar aged folks that are thinking about issues in a similar way that you might be, and you feel a little bit more open. It's amazing how different it is to be talking with a group of people that kind of openly accept some of the big issues that you want to address. And so I think there are so many threads to pull here. I want a quick time check. I know we're getting close to our 50-minute mark, so I would love to answer any questions that are in the audience today. If you want to put them in the chat or the Q&A, I'm kind of monitoring both at the same time. But we'll kind of open it up to the floor as we're fielding questions. If people have any other thoughts about this role of community giving, or how people can potentially go and create a collective giving entity themselves, or join one to get involved if they have not already done so.
And I would just pick up on your point, Peter, in that, whether it's within a family structure or it's an independent giving circle, formally or informally, I think that it serves a number of purposes that we've heard here, but one of the ones that I always try to elevate is just is reinforcing the ethos of community, of giving, of intentionality, right? So the idea that, being in conversation and community with others who are thinking about giving back, whether it's through their time, their talent, their treasure, it really elevates a conversation that's necessary for us all to have, right? When I look at, what we did to launch the Giving Pledge, it wasn't about bringing billionaires together to give more. It was about starting a dialogue on philanthropy. And in large part, it was so everyone across the wealth spectrum would reflect on what philanthropy means to them. And I think that is the power of a giving circle. And strength in numbers, right? And finding peers and finding community. So that to me is something beautiful.
Absolutely. I have a question, and it is from Lori. Ask, how do we bring millennials that aren't very involved yet into family foundations and get them engaged? Any practical suggestions? Thinking about, engagement.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to share a few. There's a lot of formal and informal ways to do this. One Peter just talked about is a next gen committee. And this can start as young as you feel fit. We see some families that do this at 10 or 12 years of age, where there's a group of people who can come together, and there is some discretionary funding that is given to that group for them to just feel the joy of giving, right? There isn't parameters given. If it's giving to the local, animal shelter because you love puppies, right? The act of giving itself is promoted, and doing that at a young age is going to be really meaningful. So really starting to think about that from a structured way with some sort of committee, some sort of group. Many families will do this in a family meeting that they convene once a year, where they're talking about this work and inviting that next generation to come into the conversation. But discretionary funding is really one way that I think is pretty powerful. And that even starts as early as, 5 years of age with the save, spend, give jars, right? And thinking about just, again, kind of inviting in that conversation, but certainly through a formal structure like a committee where you can provide some opportunities. That's one way.
And just to add to what you shared, Nick, I think to echo back around like the committee and the meetings and all of that, I think it's also important too to think about, again, this work isn't going to happen in 6 months or 2 years or even 5 years, right? Like this is lifelong work that you're going to be doing as a family or as a community or as a group of friends, whatever your sort of group of folks might be that you're bringing together. So I always joke, but one of my greatest mentors in my early 20s, when I first kind of started in the field, she said, "What do you want in your like obituary? Like, let's work backwards." And I thought it was kind of funny, but she was joking with me like, "What's your 60-year vision, Alyssa? And like, who do you want to surround you in that?" So I think there's something to that again, we sort of like the short, fast, quick turnaround, or what can we do in 3 or 5 years? And I think that just whatever space you create, knowing that maybe you can't have the types of conversations you want to have in year 1, maybe they're year 3 or 5. But being okay with kind of being patient and waiting for that moment to come as you move forward as a family.
I'd also say, bring that next generation to see the work, right? Mm-hmm. So some of this is also just do a site visit as a family, right? And talk about that, have a conversation, and really start to get engaged that way.
Yeah, and Amy, we've got like a minute or so left, but I want to bridge to this other question that we have, which asks in organizations where there are 4 generations working, how do you suggest that they make room for millennial voices to be heard? I think kind of the agency conversation is relevant here. So a couple points.
Yeah, so I've learned a lot. We run a fellowship, an intergenerational with people of all decades, which has been phenomenal. And from that, my 2 pieces of advice are to start the conversation around the youngest age. What was everybody like at the age of the youngest person? So bring everyone to common ground from the beginning. And then make, like with ground rules, really put the youngest people in the room kind of in charge of conversation. They are the ones that are asking questions. And I would also, I guess I have 3 pieces of advice. I would also spend time nurturing the youngest early on so that they feel kind of equipped and powerful as they step into the space as well.
Wonderful. So hopefully all of you have recognized why I love talking to Amy, Nick, and Alyssa. They have such a wealth of information and experiences and are open and honest about their own story. I think if you take nothing away from the session, lean into your story and try to find kind of your group of people that are willing to listen and help you grow as a person as you go throughout your life. I think, giving circles are a wonderful mechanism to do that, and really excited and thrilled that Philanthropy Together has kind of given us a little bit of space to share some of the tips and tricks along the way. So hope everyone has a great rest of the day, rest of the We Give Summit, and I will sign off here. I think we're right on time. Thanks, everybody.